Hi, everyone. I am Rebecca Wright, Director of Computer Science at Barnard, and I'm happy to welcome you to our computer science seminar today. We are very excited to have with us Lucy Simko, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the George Washington University in the GW Usable Security Lab. Her work focuses on the security and privacy-related needs, practices, and experiences of underserved populations. Her research has been widely published, including at IEEE Security and Privacy, CCS, PETS, CHI, CSCW, and IDC. So both conferences related to computer security and privacy, and conferences related to human-computer action and learning science, I believe. She is a recipient of the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship and a co-recipient of a National Science Foundation SATC Award, the Secure and Trustworthy Cybersecurity Program. And she earned her PhD in Computer Science and Engineering from the University of Washington in 2022. Lucy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'll step in front of the camera now. I'm really grateful to be here and thankful that you're all here during the reading week. And I was saying that at GW, where I am now, it's finals week, and I know it's a really tough time. So thank you all. Thank you for being here. And I'm really excited to talk about computer security and privacy for marginalized populations. I don't know if you all normally do, if you normally stop during talks. I think I
Completely up to you.
Okay, well, stop me if you're confused. It's been about like 43 minutes normally through, but just stop me if you need it. So yes, I'm Lucy. Hi, and I study usable security and privacy. And as Rebecca said, I am currently at GW as a postdoc. I finished my PhD in Seattle, and I'm also originally from New York, and I'm a very big fan of public transit, which is why I choose these maps. So let me start all the way back at security and privacy rather than usable security and privacy. Am I blocking this screen for everybody physically here? Okay. So security and privacy is important for everybody, but it's especially important for vulnerable populations because they can face higher consequences for security and privacy problems. One example of this is a certain type of phishing, and it's when somebody contacts you and they pretend to be somebody else. They might pretend to be a romantic interest or a new friend. And it often seems quite real, but then they'll ask the victim for money and probably then disappear. So if you've ever gotten a text from a professor who needs like a $50 Amazon gift card real quick, that is exactly what I'm talking about. It's often not a huge amount of money. So someone who has a little bit of a financial safety net, either their own or their families or whatever, it might be embarrassing or annoying or infuriating, but it's probably not going to hurt them significantly financially. But this type of scam would have much bigger consequences for somebody who experiences poverty. It could affect their livelihood, their groceries this month. There might be other expenses that they really, really need that money for. So that's one example of higher consequences. Another reason is that marginalized and vulnerable populations can have more determined adversaries. And one example of this is political activists. They might be pushing for major legal change or reform. They might be pushing for an entirely new government. And there might be people, either government or other actors, who really don't want them to achieve their goals. So they might be placed under surveillance. And this is an example of adversaries that are way more determined and also may have higher resources, but that's not always the case. So taken together, it's important to make sure that marginalized and vulnerable populations have access to the appropriate security and privacy mechanisms. And one of the big issues with this, the reason it's hard is that, or one of the reasons that it's hard is that technology isn't largely designed for marginalized people. And it's often misdesigned in a way that harms them. So this book, Algorithms of Oppression, is by Dr. Sophia Noble, and it shows how technology very often amplifies inequity. So an example that's on the cover of the book that you may or may not be able to read, it shows how online search can show up racially different results in a way that is not only incorrect, but also aligns with harmful stereotypes. And this also happens outside algorithmic bias. Think of online proctored exams. So when the pandemic happened, basically everyone went home from college, or a lot of people went home. And we all had to take online proctored exams, or online exams, and many of them were proctored. And these did things like room scans, they monitored the noise, they did eye tracking. And a lot of this didn't really work for somebody who shared a space with somebody else. And this is directly linked to economics. If you have roommates and or you're sharing a room with family, because it's more cost effective. This is one way that a lot of exam proctoring technologies are designed to detect help, but it also just flags people who are sharing spaces. So the question that we come to is, how do we design for equitable access to security and privacy? And there's an important difference here between equality and equity. And equality would be giving everyone the same technology, and equity is giving everyone the same opportunity. And so we want vulnerable and marginalized populations to have equitable access to security and privacy tools, and we want those tools to suit their needs and their cultural and personal identities. So to do this, we need to know what technologies they're using, why they're using them, how these technologies are benefiting and harming them. And we also need to acknowledge that security and technology don't exist in a vacuum. So we need to understand people as human beings, their personal lived experiences, their broader social and political and environmental contexts. And we also need to question why they're vulnerable and why we think of them as vulnerable. And without the answers to these questions, we can't really build technology that actually equitably serves everyone. And this is my corner of usable security and privacy. And this is what motivates me to do research. So this idea of equitable access to security and privacy is still super broad. And I have focused a lot of my work on this hypothesis that geopolitical change is directly linked to vulnerability. And I loosely define geopolitical change as a change that's driven by a massive political shift or event. Could be a war or a mass migration or a political movement. And it's important to study for a few reasons. I think first, because geopolitical change can happen anywhere to anyone at any time. And also because it's not always bad. Like elections are geopolitical change, but we need to have elections. But it's important and sometimes harder to maintain security and privacy during these times of change and sometimes crisis. And because it's harder and because it's so important, we need to make sure that we have the right tools to maintain our security and privacy. So I'm going to focus mostly on my work on geopolitical change today. And I had the pleasure of giving a talk about this broader topic about geopolitical change at Usenic's Enigma earlier this year. I've also worked with refugees and activists, people moving internationally, as well as people who helped build the Afghanistan election in 2019. And then I also have an ongoing grant about US health privacy that also fits under this category. And I'd like to take just a second to highlight how this has evolved beyond geopolitical change for me. Natural disasters are, in a sense, a little bit like geopolitical change. They happen all the time. They can happen anywhere to anyone. And there's something that involves more than computer security and privacy. People might be thinking about health, physical safety, financial well-being. So this line of work is about the technologies that people use during natural disasters and how they fit, how they don't fit, and their technical and security and privacy issues that they encounter. And then thinking about both of those, about natural disasters and geopolitical change as sources of vulnerability, sort of inherent sources, also made me think about why else people are vulnerable. So I've done a little bit of work about poverty as something that makes people vulnerable or makes it harder to maintain security and privacy, as well as some work on other socio-technical systems. And then finally, I try to offer design recommendations in most of my papers, but I also have done mostly recently some work on directly building and evaluating systems. And these are all sort of geared towards the goal of, again, equitable access to security and privacy. And today, I will just focus on these two papers. This is my first paper about geopolitical change, which is about how refugees in the US experience security and privacy mechanisms. And the most recent evolution of my interest in geopolitical change, which is about Afghanistan. And I think these papers complement each other well because they're both about how it's important to design for context, for social and political and environmental, sometimes most of the time context. But they're different because thinking about refugees, it's a very personal story of technology use. And designing an election is a story of designing computer security on a national level or a societal level. So I'm going to take 1 minute to talk about methodology now, because a lot of the questions that I ask are about what's happening and why, like what this particular group of technologies is good for, why are people using them? And these types of questions are all very exploratory. They're about iteratively building hypotheses, and they're often about hard to reach populations. So qualitative methods are really powerful for these types of questions because you often go in with one set of questions, research questions, and you come out with a different set of answers because people have told you something that you didn't even know you should ask for. And that's exactly what qualitative methods excel at. And that's like a healthy qualitative research project if that's what happens to you. So I most commonly use interviews. I've also used focus groups and qualitative small-scale surveys. I have experience with a couple other more technical methods as well, but these are a lot of the ones that I use for this type of work that's very exploratory. And to say it again and again, because as computer scientists, this is not always how we're brought up. The important thing to remember is that qualitative methods don't produce quantitatively generalizable results, and that's fine, because that's not what they're for. They're for exploring phenomena and hard to reach populations. So here's a map of what's to come. I will start with my work on refugees. I will very briefly sort of interlude the other geopolitical work, and then I will dive into the Afghanistan election work. So jumping into research, this paper is about computer security and privacy for refugees in the US, and it was published at Oakland in 2018, which is also IEEE security and privacy. Okay, so refugees are a heterogeneous group, and anyone can become a refugee, but not just anyone is a refugee. This is how the UN defines refugees. They're somebody who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a potential group, cannot return to their home country. And the number of refugees who come to the US every year varies with the US administration, but it's in the tens of thousands, and millions have come since the 80s. And when refugees arrive, they typically receive some support from the US government and from local organizations, but they still really have to work very quickly to find a job and maintain attain financial stability. And it depends on the person's situation, but they often work with these local NGOs. And at the NGOs, there are ESL teachers, there are caseworkers, and caseworkers might do everything from helping them find a job to helping them find housing and just kind of whatever they need in their lives. And they're also often volunteers. And one of the reasons that I was able to do this work is because I was a volunteer. When I started grad school in Seattle, I started volunteering at a local NGO. And about a year in, I realized that the refugees that I was working with faced challenges and barriers with computer security that I hadn't really ever seen before in my life. And I also hadn't seen them explored in computer security. So this paper is about those challenges and barriers. And it's largely about the challenges and barriers that sort of come from this process of establishing their lives. And in studying these barriers with maintaining and attaining strong security practices, we study what are their security practices, how do they use technology, and also how do they learn about security and privacy, who do they learn from? So for this, I conducted 9 interviews with case managers and ESL teachers, and they were all from the NGO where I interviewed. And we also did 3 focus groups with refugees. They were Syrian and Somali, and we did them separately for linguistic reasons. So we did focus groups because one of the case managers had recommended it. And most of the case managers were refugees themselves, and they knew the context very well. And they said there would be a power dynamic. So they'd be more comfortable in focus groups, and I think it was a really good decision. For analysis of this data, we followed a standard qualitative analysis protocols. We rigorously analyzed the data. So the first step was transcribing the audio the audio recordings. I inductively created a codebook. So this is like a gathering of themes that occurred in the interviews. And then, so for example, a theme could be like uses two-factor authentication or has trouble remembering passwords. This is a teaser for the rest. And then once we have that codebook or the list of themes, I and a second person, we applied the codebook to the transcripts. And this means that we went through the codebook and each transcript multiple times together forever and ever to see where each theme occurred. And this is where some of the rigor comes in, where you apply it exhaustively. When I report results in this project and the next, and this is standard in a lot of qualitative work, I typically give quotes. Here I'll attribute them to case managers or teachers, and then in other projects, they're just from participants in general. So there's a lot in this paper, but I think that there's one seemingly simple process that can show a lot about the themes, and this is resetting a password on a computer. So one of the keys here is to remember that job applications are almost entirely online these days. And this means that people have to log into email on a computer. And in this context, it's usually a public computer for two reasons. One, because they often don't have smartphones at home. I mean, they often have smartphones, but they don't have computers at home. And they often need help. So it's helpful to have it be in a public place. So me or their caseworker or their teacher or another refugee there can help them. And this means that one barrier to security right away is that they're using public computers. So this is an important piece of context, because this means that when we think about solutions, we need to think about solutions that work on public computers. And this is a totally different dynamic than a computer where you are the only user or you trust all the users and you administer it yourself. So there was a small computer lab in this NGO where I volunteered, where all of the participants and all the participants were from. And the refugees would use that computer. It was sort of semi-public. And they would sometimes have my and their case managers and their teachers help if they wanted it. And a number of the people who were refugees had never used computers before. And this is not uncommon for some people, for example, who come from Somalia. Somali refugees often spend years or decades in refugee camps, often in Kenya, and they often don't have computers there, or maybe there's one computer for the whole refugee camp. So they may be completely proficient and fluent with smartphones, but the actual mechanics of using a keyboard and mouse are really hard to learn, especially as an adult. So what this means with authentication is that if you're still learning how to type, when you type in your password, it comes up at these little black dots. And it's hard to know if you put it in correctly. And it's really frustrating if you are using the hunt peck method and maybe you're not super great at accuracy with typing. And there can often be a show password checkbox there, but it's like, imagine you don't even know English very well. Like, you're not going to know to check the show password box. So another basic issue is that it's hard to remember passwords. And this is a problem that is not unique to refugees, but I think they have some context that sort of makes this more difficult for them. They sort of have this idea of information overload, and that's what this quote is about, that there's a new language, there's new usernames and passwords, there's new personal identifiers. And so this case manager and other teachers said that forgotten passwords were really common. And remember that because we're on public computers, password managers are not really an option. So there are other alternative authentication mechanisms that you might think could work, like FIDO keys, like a little hardware key you can plug into a computer that says it's yours, or if it's you. You can sometimes use a second factor of authentication, like a text to your phone, as the only factor of authentication. But we didn't see anybody using these, so it's not included in the study. But I think, like, going forward, this could be interesting to say, okay, why are people not using those? Is this an option? But just to put that out there, because that is something people often think about. Passwords are not the only thing we have. But moving on to password resets, and that's really the core of this example, but it's important to know how we got here because of the information overload and the use of public computers. And one common way of resetting passwords is the use of security questions. And prior work has shown that security questions don't really provide a whole lot of security, because when you answer them truthfully, they're often information that can be socially engineered out of you, or it's just something that's already public. And the problem that refugees and a lot of other people encounter is that many of these security questions are not culturally relevant to them. So if you think about mother's maiden name, there are a lot of people around the world who don't change their names when they get married. And this question just simply does not apply. Thinking about the make and model of your first car, I am in like the one place in the US where a lot of people, and I had this too, you don't have a driver's license right away. I didn't have one until I was in my early 20s, and by then I had a lot of email accounts. So how would I answer this? I would make something up, but it becomes another barrier. And thinking about favorite colors, if you're just learning English, you might pick a color name that's kind of common, and it might make it easier to guess. So this quote is saying that it's not so much that they can't make up the answers. They can make up the answers. Anyone can make up the answers. But it becomes another thing to remember and forget. It becomes another way to lose access. It's another hoop to jump through. It can be confusing. And it's just another barrier to security and privacy. So we have password resets, we have security questions. Another thing that you might do as part of a password reset is put in some personal information like a birthday. And just as there are a lot of places in the world where women don't change their names, there are also a lot of places in the world where people don't keep track of their exact birthday because it's not culturally and legally relevant. But it turns out that in the US, it is culturally and legally relevant. So when people arrive in the US, they have to pick a legal birthday. And a lot of people pick January 1st, I assume because it's easy to remember. And this means that when we design authentication or disambiguation schemes that use birthdays, we probably assume a mostly random distribution of birthdays, but this breaks for refugees because their birthdays are often not randomly distributed. And this, of course, highly depends on where they come from. So finally, another way to reset a password is often multi-factor authentication. So a text to your phone or something like that. And this leverages the fact that the user has another device, that they trust the device, and they can get into it. And refugees that I worked with often actually used 2FA to successfully get back into their accounts and reset their passwords. And this means that it's a positive example of a security mechanism that worked with their cultural and personal context, and it worked well. So there's a lot more in this paper, but I want to wrap up and call your attention to a few very high-level things. And I hope that it became sort of clear how something like a password reset incorporates security and privacy mechanisms that become barriers to security and privacy because they aren't culturally fit to users' backgrounds. And this also shows how important it is to understand the socio-technical context, especially for vulnerable and marginalized users. And then one thing that I didn't get to talk about quite as much, but I still hope it came through, was the relationship between the case managers and the refugees, as well as the teachers, but really often the case managers, because they actually kind of co-managed the email accounts to a large extent. They were incredible assets to the refugees. They helped them a lot, as I was telling you. But we also learned that many of them had suboptimal password management strategies for their clients' accounts. We heard about one person who when they were helping them reset passwords and create accounts, they would give everyone the same password. Another person who had a plain text document of all their clients' passwords. And this isn't because they were malicious, it's because they're extremely busy people. This security and privacy is not their goal. And because thinking back to this idea of a public computer and now a co-managed account, there is no technology that fits that. And that's why this is happening. It's not their fault. It's because the technology we have does not yet support this need. So I think what this brings me to is we need to build better technology to fit that need. So now I'll move on to this brief interlude about other work. And this work with refugees, which was one of my first papers in grad school, sparked this curiosity to me about geopolitical change. I continued to volunteer for a while, but I had to stop, but I was still able to pursue my interest in change in different ways. And here are some of the ways. So maybe 2 years ago or so, I gave a version of the talk I just gave about refugees and computer security as a guest lecture at GW before I worked there. And the students and I ended up having a conversation about moving to the US in general and how that affects people's perceptions of security and privacy. And they began this paper, and then I was able to join later. And it's about how it feels to go through the visa process in the US. And we found that the visa process itself is this combination of opaque and invasive in a way that makes applicants feel worried about their security and privacy. And we also have a few findings about how bureaucracy and policy themselves exacerbate these feelings. So going back a couple years in time, this paper is about something entirely different, but still very corely about geopolitical change. It's about revolution. This is about revolution in Sudan. And I think it's a really interesting application of security and privacy because you have activists who are using probably consumer technology and the government who, in this case, had complete control over the telecommunications network. And they also had some control, depending on the point in the revolution, over the military and the police. So there's a massive power dynamic here. And the question is, how do activists use the tools that they have to overthrow the government and organize, or are the tools a detriment? So in this paper, we interviewed 14 Sudanese activists after the fact, and before a lot of what's going on now started. And one takeaway was that there were a variety of low-tech defensive strategies that they used in really amazing ways. And this paper also really spoke to the political and social context, so both domestically and internationally, and how that drove their adoption and their use of technology during the revolution. And then finally, I have some exciting and ongoing and future work about health privacy in the US, and I'm part of a team that was awarded an NSF SATC grant. It's about a holistic and ecosystem-wide view of privacy for vulnerable populations, and especially surrounding healthcare. All right, so moving on to this next project about the Afghanistan elections. This is an evolution of my interest in geopolitical change, and I think it really has moved to like a systemic level on how we really design big systems. Not just computer systems, like socio-technical systems. So elections are really one of the cornerstones of democracy. They drive political change, sort of by definition, and it's really, really important that elections are legitimate, which means that every piece of technology involved has to be secure and private. It has to withstand a potentially very strong adversary, which could be a nation state or multiple nation states. All the technologies involved have to be usable by everyone, from election officials to voters to anyone else in between, and it all has to be trusted. So it turns out that's really hard to do. And that's how this paper is about how all of that happened in Afghanistan in 2019. And I want to highlight one of the other authors here, who is Kabir Panahi, who is the lead student author. I am the senior author on this paper. And he is from Afghanistan. He worked for the Election Commission in Afghanistan during the 2019 election. And I love this paper. I'm really proud of this paper, not only because I advised it, but because I think it shows the power of qualitative research in exploring really big socio-technical systems and in ways that haven't really been studied before in computer science or computer security research communities. So let me start with some background about Afghanistan and democracy in Afghanistan. Afghanistan held elections from 2001 to 2021 in that period of government. In 2021, the Taliban seized power and the government is no longer democratic, and the Taliban is also not recognized as a legitimate government. But from this period from 2001 to 2021, they had a president and a parliament, and both were democratically elected. But the elections faced a lot of problems. There was systemic fraud. It was really blatant. The US and UN at times stepped in to mediate and count ballots. At one point, there were more registered voters than eligible voters. And there are also corroborated tales, not just one-off tales, of ballot boxes being entirely stuffed for one candidate, which is a canonical marker of fraud. And Afghanistan has also faced decades of war, and with this war are internal and external threats to democracy. So thinking about this systemic fraud, the Afghan government made the switch to using biometrics to verify voters' identities. And they did this in 2019, specifically to mitigate the fraud. The idea is that everybody has a unique fingerprint, and if you get two votes with the same fingerprint, you can know that one of them is fraud. And this is a picture of election workers who were configuring these devices that they had. They were kind of like little Android phones. So they contracted with a European country to create these devices. They deployed them during the 2019 election. And then on election day, what would happen is poll workers would check in voters and check their biometrics. They would take their photograph and their fingerprint, And then if they passed, they would let them vote. And the devices, these little devices would then send results over the cell network to Kabul at the end of the election day. And it sounded like a good idea, but it was a mess on election day and it was a mess afterwards. There are documented stories of poll workers not being able to use these machines, people not being able to cast votes, votes that were cast not being counted. And in the end, there was this 5-month delay in results. They'd originally promised them in like initial results in maybe 24 hours and then final results in a month, I think. But it took 5 months. And in these 5 months, there was a lot of turmoil and debates between the two top candidates about how to count the votes, bias, accusations of fraud. And at the center of all of this was this biometric voting or voter verification technology. And I will call these the BVVs because it's a big mouthful to say the whole thing. But so yeah, at the center was this new idea of biometric voter verification. And that's what this paper is about. It's about what happened. We want to know, how were the BVVs integrated into the system? What did they do? What did they not do? What were they supposed to do? Along with this, we want to ask what happened and why, as well as what were the consequences of this? And my favorite thing about this paper is that our data takes us from non-technical causes, like how was the vendor selected, to non-technical consequences, like political instability. And we tie it back to these specific functionality and design misalignments of the voter verification systems. And before I dive into the results, I want to say 2 things that we're not doing. We're not assessing whether these devices were good or bad, whether it was success or failure. And we're also not assigning blame to any one party or person. And this is for a few reasons. It's because we're just researchers, and this is an interview study, as we'll see. We don't have the contract between the vendor and the Afghan government. We don't have the design specs. This would be super interesting, but that's not what we have, so we can't know. And I also think it's more interesting and maybe more of a contribution to science to think about how and why the use of these biometric voter verification machines supported or violated democracy, rather than deciding about a thing that has already happened. What can we learn? So we applied qualitative methods again in this project, and we conducted 18 interviews. As I told you in the beginning, Kabir, the first author, worked in Afghanistan as part of the Electoral Commission, so he was able to leverage his professional network. And we interviewed 18 electoral experts who worked on the actual election that we're studying in Afghanistan. And these interviews were very broad. They covered a lot of topics about how the devices worked, about usability, about the results afterwards, as well as about how the Afghan people felt about the system. Some of the interviews were in Dari and some were in English. And one question throughout this work was always how to do this safely and ethically. So it's possible, for example, that if we publish a result that basically says how to cause problems on one specific voting technology, and that voting technology gets used in the future, somebody could use our paper to influence an election. That is not something that we want. So we're in the process of disclosing everything to the vendor and helping them fix it, we hope. Another thing to be concerned about is participant and researcher safety. So we did a few things that are really standard in qualitative work. We got IRB approval, of course. Everyone in the paper is de-identified. I will not tell you anything about them, just that they are participants who are experts, and they're de-identified both in the transcripts and in the paper. And then the biggest thing we really did was we trusted Kabir, who is from Afghanistan and knows the context very well and worked there. And we trusted the participants to assess their own safety. So he had a discussion with everybody before each interview and said, like, do you feel safe doing this? Let's talk about the consequences. And what we found is that some people who were still in Afghanistan said they didn't want to participate for safety reasons. And we said, okay, thank you for your time. We won't talk to you again about this. And people outside Afghanistan felt much safer doing it. And this aligns with how Kabir himself feels about it. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into the results, and I'd like to give you a few examples of technical functionality and security issues. And this first one has to do with the timestamps on the votes that got cast. Let me take a drink so my voice doesn't die. Okay, so Afghan law says that in order for a vote to be valid, it has to be cast between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. on election day because that's when the polls are open. And it seems reasonable because votes that are cast when the polls aren't open are probably fraudulent. And the timestamps were set by these VVV devices, and that also seems kind of reasonable. And I'm going to use this box to represent the VVVs. But the problem is the timestamp on each VVV was set manually by election workers. And the really big problem is that there were 39,000 BVVs in Afghanistan. So when you have people doing something 39,000 times, there's going to be manual error. And let me make this slightly more complicated. What actually happened was the central election workers in Kabul, they set up the devices, they set the timestamps. Then all the BVs got put on a truck. They traveled to the polling centers all throughout Afghanistan. And then sometimes along the way, something went wrong. Either they didn't get turned off or like there was an error, or I actually don't know what went wrong, but sometimes they arrived and they had to be reset. So this is another opportunity for manual error. And to add to that, we heard that education rates are a lot lower in remote provinces outside of Kabul, and the BVVs were not really suited to the education levels there. So a lot of the poll workers had trouble using them and resetting them. So sometimes what happened was there was a date that was 10 years in the future, or AM and PM are switched. And this is a quote from somebody explaining it. And they said those irregular votes were considered fraud. Some devices were set up wrongly, and I believe it's supposed to say 2021 or 29, sorry. We can't say that it's fraud, but it's likely the mistake of someone who configured the device. And one of the reasons this is so significant is that there were 100,000 of these votes that were out of time, out of about 1.8 million total. So it's like a kind of significant fraction of the votes here. And one of the things that I think about when I think of this is like it's pretty standard practice in a lot of design of systems to automatically set the time of date. There are a lot of ways to do this. You can use satellites, you can use atomic clocks. There may be other ways that I'm not aware of. And I just think about the consequences of making this decision to not set the time and date automatically. These were part of the reason there were 5 months of delay, because they saw this and one candidate said, hey, that's not fair. And the other one said, but the law says we can't count those. And this kind of went on for a long time. They went to the vendor. And maybe if they just set them automatically, I mean, I don't know, something different could have happened. But I think it's interesting to think about the consequences of this particular decision. Absolutely.
Is it possible to recreate the process? Is there sort of forensic analysis on an individual device that tells us, when the timestamp was changed, or how many times, or what it was set to, or is that information all lost?
That's a super interesting question. I don't know. I do know that the BVV devices themselves are not accessible to people outside Afghanistan. So my understanding is that they are in a warehouse that the current government does not want anyone to access. But I don't know if you had one, could you see the history? Yeah. My very vague understanding is that there's the way that the working memory and like the disk works may be a little bit unusual, but I'm not entirely sure. But I think it's a great question. Thank you for that. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, thank you. I will move on to a couple more quicker issues that happened here. And while I go through these, I'm going to sum up their effects on the election using this thing on the side here about electoral goals. So these are 3 electoral goals that showed up in our data set, and I think fairly standard for elections. So voter enfranchisement means everyone gets to vote who wants to vote. Anti-fraud means that there's 1 vote per person and only 1 vote per person. And public trust is that everyone trusts the system. There's no disputes afterwards. Everyone understands what it does. And I think you've seen from what I've talked about that the decision or the issues with the timestamps negatively affected these 2. So of the other issues, one was battery life. So I told you that when the BVBs got out to the polling stations, some of them had to be reset. And another thing that maybe happened was that they just didn't have enough charge. And this was a problem because they didn't have electricity in a lot of these polling stations and the batteries didn't last the whole day. So similarly, this also led to disenfranchisement, and it also led to a lack of trust when sort of stories got out about this. Another issue related to this is that BVBs ran very slowly in the heat. Not all provinces were super hot, but some of them were. And this person estimated that it would take 3 minutes for someone to vote when it was really hot because they were running super slow. Because there wasn't air conditioning, because they didn't have electricity. And if the polls are open for 10 hours and it's 3 minutes per vote, that's 20 people per hour. And the math just really doesn't work out there. And that's what this person is saying, that if everyone had participated, they would have had to turn people away. So again, this is voter disenfranchisement and a lack of public trust. But this is actually about violation and support of election goals. So some participants told us that it was actually the very use of technology that made people feel safe voting. And this is supporting the goal of voter enfranchisement. And other participants told us that some people did not vote because of the technology, because the Taliban had threatened to physically harm people who voted. We also learned about the use of photographs as biometrics as something that precluded some women from voting. So this participant talks about how, quote, in the conservative and male-dominant society like Afghanistan, men didn't allow their wives or daughters to be photographed. A lot of Afghan women did vote, but there is a subset of women who could not vote because of the design of technology. And I think this is just a theme that's building here, that the very fact that there was technology and the way it was designed at a high and low level created both voter enfranchisement and disenfranchisement. So I haven't really talked about fraud yet, and the BVBs did have an effect on fraud. It's somewhat hard to measure in an absolute sense, but participants said that BVBs seemed to prevent or deter the systemic fraud that was prevalent in prior elections. So for comparison, there were, I think, 7 million votes in the 2014 election, and there were like 1.8 million in this. So is that less fraud? Is that fewer voters? Probably both. So that supports this goal of anti-systemic fraud. But we heard that while they also prevented ballot stuffing, but they also may have prevented smaller scale fraud where someone would vote like with their index fingers, but also with their pinkies. So there are many more technical issues. But let me wrap up by saying that many of the same high-level themes about political and social and environmental context are present here as in the other work that I've talked about, and how it's incredibly important to understand users' context when designing technology. This research in particular gets at the catastrophic and systemic consequences of technical designs that aren't aligned with people's needs. And this paper goes one step farther because of the expertise of the participants, and we're able to get at some reasons why the tech was misdesigned. And one reason was that they simply didn't have enough time. The devices got to Kabul like 1 month before the election, and it wasn't enough time to train people or learn how they worked. Another reason is that there were issues with voter registration, and there was also not a national census, and this makes it hard to allocate resources appropriately. And finally, participants told us about this power imbalance between the vendor and the Afghan agencies that were deploying the technology. So for example, they relied on the vendor for technical support because they had to, because it was essentially a black box. It was very opaque, but they could only talk to them about 3 days a week because of holiday schedules and time differences. So this paper is a lot about political, societal, and environmental context and how that's so incredibly important. But it's also about how bureaucracy can affect actual technical security. And all of these themes also come out more broadly in a lot of my other work about geopolitical change and security and privacy. So I'm going to briefly turn to some ideas for future work. And I'm also very excited to create new ideas.
Question,
Yes.
did they correlate the fingerprint with the identity or with the vote? Or just use the fingerprints to look for duplication?
The vendor used them to look for duplication. And that is a great question that I can discuss slightly more offline. But yes, they did not correlate them with identities.
Is It's very low anti-fraud measures in other countries, like for example, in Indian elections, you just get your index finger painted,
Right.
indigo, either blue finger for a few days, but you can't vote twice because,
Interesting.
they just see if you've got the ink on your finger. There's no attempt to do that other than be cross-checking fingerprints.
It's super interesting. I actually don't know if they've done that in previous years in Afghanistan. From hearing these interviews, one suspicion is that the idea of technology itself was very exciting to the people who were implementing it. And we have some quotes from people who are kind of like, technology, it's going to miraculously solve all our problems. Like, we need technology to fight this fraud. And I think kind of what you're getting at is that like maybe they didn't.
Yeah, there's also the possibility, you mentioned timestamp errors, but there's also a possibility of timestamp sabotage, because if you know that inaccurate timestamps are going to be thrown out, right? Votes based on inaccurate. A very easy way to throw out a bunch of votes is just change the timestamp.
Yeah, well, so I'm not sure, but I think that like someone with advanced forensic skills could have done that. But I think I think it would be hard to change them in retrospect.
No, not retrospect. Somebody at a polling station.
Change
Somebody
it.
at a polling station.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Because different preferences from the majority of the electorate, like location. You just put in, 2029 as timestamp, and that's it. All those votes get thrown out.
Certainly, yeah, absolutely. But this is kind of a tension in election work, I think, because you have to give poll workers some responsibility and power. You have to trust them.
Right, but the design of the mechanism can prevent
Yes.
abuse or not prevent abuse.
Yes.
Facilitate or prevent abuse. That's
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It's just a total failure of KISS to go with something like a fingerprint app. Like you said, just paint the finger. Because there's much more low-tech ways to do these things. I mean, even in New York State, it's paper ballots that are scanned into a machine but are retained for, to resolve disputes.
Yeah.
And by the way, New York State poll workers also don't use the technology.
I suspect that it's possible that with just a finger, like one thing the tech provided was actual like external prevention of systemic fraud. So it's possible that a warlord could come and pay off the poll workers. And if the poll workers have complete control over, your finger's printed, oh, I didn't see your finger painted, magically come and vote, for the 100th time or whatever. I kind of suspect that's something that
If they're using a painted finger, they're still stuffing paper ballots. There's no correlation.
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why like the history of fraud is so important to this, but I think this also had a lot of problems. Yeah. Thank you. Is there anything else we should discuss about this paper? We can also, I'm nearly done. I could also stop here if we really wanted to.
It's your future ideas.
yeah.
Okay. Some of them are election related. Yes, so this is very electoral, so it's not the projects that I have on here. Political or geopolitical change and political change is just something that I think is fascinating. And the genesis of this idea was when the Ukraine war started, and a friend of mine's dad asked me, he told me that he was scared of Russian malware, and he asked me what he could do to protect himself because of this new war. And I basically said nothing. But it's really interesting that you asked that. And I think that like I hypothesize that in general, people's feelings of security and privacy might fluctuate with what's going on, whether they trust their leaders with geopolitical events. And this is something that I'd like to study both longitudinally and deeply about why this happens. And then thinking more inward about methodology, I think this is just kind of a subfield that is growing now. And I think it's really important, this idea of studying different populations and making sure that we're designing and we know how to design. But it's actually not super diverse methodologically. We tend to use surveys, sometimes ethnography, interviews, focus groups, but I think there are more out there. And there may be even new methods that will help us learn and design better. And then I also think it would be really wonderful to codify some standards for researcher and participant safety, like particularly when studying election workers or activists. And that's what I'm super excited about there. So These are all my wonderful collaborators who I love very much, and it's roughly divided into faculty on the left and students on the right. And I'm going to put up this gigantic slide of everything that I have done and remind you that these are the 2 projects that I talked about. And this is the end of my talk. I'll just have this here in case, I don't know, you zoned out for the entire talk and would like to know what I do. And this is what I do.
Additional questions?
It's a broad question. So you identified problems with the technologies, both with the refugee case and with the Afghan case.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether this is, I'm an outsider and I'm going to send this honorary temporary CS while we build the department, but I'm just wondering whether the next step seems to be designing or thinking about robust mechanisms that can be immune to these kind of problems. I mean, could you say just a bit about that, or is that not within the scope of your research?
No, it certainly is. Thus far, I have not had the opportunity to do very much designing. And I think when I started my postdoc, my advisors kind of said, what do you want to do? And I said, well, design seems really cool. Like, I think you're right. This is like, we know some of the problems, we know some of the scope. There's so much more to do in like understanding what problems are, what context is, even what questions to ask. But yes, I think you're completely right. And I think one direction I'd hope to go in there is like lots of collaborations. I have a collaboration with Brave Browser currently, where they built this really cool private browsing. It's sort of like private browsing. It's like tab-based suggested to you private browsing. We're helping evaluate that for them. But yeah, I think that trying to design solutions at a systemic level is exactly the next step for a lot of this. Thank you.
Yes. Sticking with the design theme of the question, then can you talk about, and the election was maybe a good example for this, but so the extent to which, based on the work you've done understanding uses and users and vulnerable populations, you know, how much hope is there for general design principles, for designs that work for, you know, with configurations perhaps, but that sort of incorporate lots of ideas and potential benefits and drawbacks and do something sensible, and how much is it really like each use and use case is going to need, you know, a lot of resources, a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, a lot of local knowledge or domain knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think there are a lot of parts to that. I mean, I hope I do at least half of them justice, but I hope you will bring me back to the parts that I happen to skip over. I think there are some things that will stay the same. And I think maybe cryptography is like, we know a lot of like what is good and what is not good. And of course it gets a lot more complicated, as I know, you know, but like, that's something where we can say like, don't roll your own. Don't do this. Like, you don't need to change that as much per context. There are implementations you should use. I think it may be more of like sometimes user facing stuff. Sometimes not. Sometimes it's about like how you store data. It's about threat modeling. I think not that elections are the easy case in any means, but they're at least, it's not like the Google sign-in page that everyone around the world is using. Like thinking about the Afghanistan election, it was incredibly hard. There are just so many languages and cultural contexts and ethnic contexts within Afghanistan that designing one interface would be extremely difficult, but it's only within Afghanistan. It's not like you have to design it for Afghanistan and the US and China and Australia. So I think like starting with those sort of more local contexts, I don't think there's ever a way to skip learning local contexts. And I don't think that's what you were suggesting either, but I think it makes this really, really hard. And I think the hardest part of your question is about like this idea of universal or general design. And I don't know. It kind of scares me because I do a lot of pointing out problems and saying like, well, this design doesn't work for this set of people. But the same design that would work for those people might not work for the original group of people. And I don't really know how to put that together, because if you give people all the options, then you end up with this gargantuan like interface where no one's going to use that. I think there's probably a lot of work to be done in that area to sort of find a happy medium where people have what they need, but they're not overwhelmed. That was a great question though. Thank you.
It's really again, sort of like ping pong, yeah.
Yeah.
But the problems that we are common to many societies, especially South Africa, and certainly within the diverse populations, different languages, different degrees of education, very low literacy rates in some rural areas. So, I mean, if one can solve, there might be a general and a specific component to a solution, and the generalizable component might apply to quite a broad range of societies, it seems to me.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I learned recently that ballot design can be really important to get right, and also very context specific. But I think you're right that like there are principles from ballot design, there are principles from election security design.
Fine-tuning that can be based on.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very related with this, but so can you think this in terms of how can you design systems that are adaptable for different contexts, right? So you're talking about the security question. So one of the issues in machine learning is that we want, for example, you want to adapt to, a model that is general, but to adapt it to different contexts. But with the imagine security questions that are adaptable to a particular context, and you change that. So maybe some in the techniques of the security in that space, maybe that would be something that might be
Yeah, I think it's
a
a
challenge in the design.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think security questions are an interesting point, because I actually wish kind of security questions would kind of go away, but they won't. As someone who recently created a lot of accounts, there's so many security questions I answered, and so many times I lied about what my mother's maiden name was. And yeah, they're just all over. And I wonder if we just need like a different mechanism, like a FIDO key, I think is a lot more usable. You have the problem that if you lose it, like you lose your house keys, then like it's just another thing that you've lost, and that's really bad. But I think thinking about these other mechanisms, one thing that people talk about a lot in usable security is assets-based design. So designing for like the strengths of a group rather than what they don't have. And I think that is a way to sort of find what you're talking about, like redesigning and giving flexibility.
Great. Let's thank Lucy again. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Lucy, for being here. For those of you who are students, if you are interested at 3:30 today in the 5th floor of Milstein, in kind of that corner, she will be available to chat with you and have some cookies.
Yeah, please come. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you.